Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Jeremy Ganner, the Executive Director of the Davi Center at UC Davis. I'm here to welcome you to the Vanderbilt Studio Theater. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Chancellor's Colloquium, a debate on public funding for research. A few reminders: look around and locate the nearest exit, which in most cases is probably behind you. If you have a mobile device with you, please turn it off, or if you're able, otherwise please silence it and dim the screen. As we get ready for tonight's experience, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Catchell-Dehee Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dehee Wintun Nation, and Yocha-Dehee Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We're in for a fascinating evening, another wonderful Chancellor's Colloquium. We're so glad you're here, and it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce UC Davis Chancellor Gary May.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good evening and welcome to the winter 2026 edition of the Chancellor's Colloquium. This distinguished speaker series was created to spark dialogue and gain insights about the most pressing issues we face today. Today we're dipping into new territory for the Colloquium. This is the first time that the Colloquium has featured a debate. This approach represents our respect for freedom of speech as a core value that's vital to our mission at UC Davis. And our principles of community emphasize open dialogue to foster mutual respect for and understanding. More than ever, we need to allow for an exchange of ideas that is at the heart of democracy's roots. We need people who can engage in civil discourse, disagree respectfully, and build bridges instead of walls. Today's debate will be moderated by the Steamboat Institute, a think tank that focuses on liberty, individualism, and defending freedom. They've previously hosted debates on college campuses about artificial intelligence, tariffs, and free speech. The topic of tonight's debate, however, is, be it resolved, scientific progress is best achieved through publicly funded research initiative. This issue is central to higher education. UC Davis and other universities around the country are grappling with federal research funding. Our university, we've seen early terminations of research contracts and grants, and we are currently still bracing for broader impact. And though I'm not debating, I believe myself that federally funded research is a critical partnership that has demonstrated its positive impact in American lives and our global economic leadership over several decades. Not to put my finger on the scale here for the debaters, sorry. The United States has led the world in technology and innovation, and that's because of federal investments in great part, and often at early stages of research. So I'm eager to hear what transpires in the debate. But now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Schubert-Aiken. She is the chairman and CEO of the Steamboat Institute. Jennifer holds an MBA from St. Edward's University in Austin and founded the Steamboat Institute in 2008. She has the honor of introducing today's moderator and panelists, and I thank them for joining us and leading what I expect to be a rigorous debate. Jennifer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chancellor May, for your very warm welcome. It's an honor to open the 9th season of our Campus Liberty Tour debate series here at UC Davis as part of the Chancellor's Colloquium. Yours is definitely one of the most beautiful campuses we've visited. Despite the rain, I got out for a run on the Arboretum Trail this morning, and it was just beautiful. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know it's a little cold and wet. And I also want to thank all of those who are watching the live stream. We have people from all over the country who watch our debates on YouTube. Steamboat Institute was founded in 2008 in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, which I will point out is home to 9 members of Team USA competing in the Winter Olympics. So we're very proud of that. Steamboat Institute has the mission of promoting America's founding principles and fostering an appreciation of the freedom we enjoy as Americans. We've hosted dozens of debates on college campuses all over America for the past 8 years, visiting more than 30 campuses. With each of our debates, the emphasis is on critical thinking. It's about how to think, not what to think. When you come to a Steamboat Institute debate, you are always welcome, regardless of your political ideology or position on the issue being debated. We want you to feel welcome and just to listen and learn. We are also proud to have Vikram Amar, who is a UC Davis law professor, on our Campus Liberty Tour Advisory Board. Tonight is the first of 5 stops in our spring Campus Liberty Tour. In March, we will visit Pepperdine University in Malibu with a debate on whether the failure of civic education in schools is the primary cause of ideological partisanship. 1 week later, we will visit the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with a debate on whether America has lived up to the promises of its founding 250 years ago. In April, we will visit Arizona State with a debate on whether the U.S. government should have the power to mandate vaccines. And we will close the spring tour with a debate at the University of Colorado Boulder on U.S. foreign policy and America's role in the world. So there is truly a variety of topics being covered this spring. With all of our debates, you can watch live from anywhere in the country on Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel. So we hope you will sign up for our email list at steamboatinstitute.org to have these notices sent directly to your inbox. All of our previous debates, by the way, are available on our YouTube channel. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences across the country. I would like to extend a special thank you to our major sponsors, the Adolph Coors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and Bruce and Marcy Benson for their support, which has allowed us to expand this program to more than 30 college campuses. As a premier public research university, UC Davis is the perfect setting for tonight's debate, which asks a deceptively simple question with enormous consequences. Is scientific progress best achieved through publicly funded research initiatives? At stake is more than just budgets and bureaucracy. This question shapes who sets the scientific agenda, which problems get solved, and who ultimately benefits from this discovery. Public funding has helped drive some of the most transformative breakthroughs in modern history, often supported by long-term, high-risk research that private markets might avoid. But critics argue that government-funded science can be slow, politically influenced, and less responsive than privately driven innovation. We invite all of our audience members, including the live stream viewers, to respond with your view on this resolution. Is scientific progress best achieved through publicly funded research initiatives? So agree, disagree, or undecided before the debate begins using the QR code provided. I think you'll see that we already have the poll going on. This is a live poll, so if you've not voted, pull out your phone. It's one time when it's not rude to pull out your phone, and be sure and vote. Then when the debate is over and you've heard both sides, we're going to ask you to vote again, and we will see how these numbers have changed. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening. So let's welcome them to the stage, and I will then introduce each of them while they remain seated. Please welcome our speakers and moderator. All right. Our Arguing the affirmative on tonight's resolution is Jon Hartley, economist and policy fellow at the Hoover Institution. Jon is the host of the podcast Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century. Jon is also a research fellow at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, a member of the Canadian Group of Economists, and founding chair of the Economic Club of Miami. Jon previously worked at Goldman Sachs Asset Management and in various policy and governmental roles at the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and the Bank of Canada. Jon has been a regular economics contributor for National Review Online, Forbes, and the Huffington Post, and has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today, and other publications. He has appeared on CNBC, Fox Business, Fox News, Bloomberg, and NBC. Jon received his BA in Economics and Mathematics from the University of Chicago, his MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and his Master's in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. Please give a warm welcome to Jon Hartley. Arguing the negative on tonight's resolution is Jon Early, mathematical economist and adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Jon is also president of Vital Few, LLC, which is a consulting firm that uses data-driven mathematical and economic principles to solve operational and financial issues for businesses. His recent work includes documenting impediments to progress in health research at the National Institutes of Health. He previously served as assistant commissioner at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where he directed operations for the Consumer Price Index and other key indicators. Jon is the co-author of The Myth of American Inequality, one of the Wall Street Journal's best books of 2022, which is based on the premise that misleading government statistics have led many Americans to misperceive the prevalence of poverty, the degree of inequality, and the changes in these measures in recent decades. Jon holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from Rice University and an MA in International Political Economy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please give a warm welcome to Jon Early. Our moderator for this evening's debate is Carrie Sheffield. Carrie is a writer, broadcaster, and musician based in Washington, D.C., and is a senior policy analyst at Independent Women's Forum. Carrie earned a master's in public policy from Harvard, concentrating in business policy. She also earned a BA with honors in communications at Brigham Young University and completed a Fulbright Fellowship in Berlin. Carrie managed municipal credit risk at Goldman Sachs and served as lead analyst on a $5 billion portfolio of healthcare bonds at Moody's Ratings. Carrie has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, CNN Opinion, the New York Times, Washington Post, and many others. She's a frequent guest on major media networks, including Fox News, Newsmax, MSNBC, CNN, and others. And her best-selling book, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journal of Healing and Forgiveness, was published in 2024. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Carrie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited for this. If you didn't know, you all are invited to be part of this debate. Later on, after we have our opening statements, we're going to put up a place where you can submit your questions to these two debaters. And I will be feeding only the good ones, the best ones, that rise to the top, with a question mark at the end, not a rant, with no question. I will be feeding them to these two esteemed panelists. So in the meantime, if you haven't registered your vote, please lock it in so we can get a sense. The way we run these debates is that it's really about the change, the delta between where the audience is now versus the end, because you never know who's going to be in the room. And so when we're trying to measure who's most effective, we ask the same question at the end. So this is where we are right now. If folks are still voting, feel free to hit that QR code, put your vote in. But it looks like overall, Jon Early, the audience does not agree with you. So we'll see how persuasive you are by the end of this debate.
It gives me an opportunity, and hey, it can't get worse.
I like this optimism. So there we are. So we've got 78% agree with the proposition, 3% disagree, and 20% are undecided. So maybe that's some of your opportunity right there. So to kick things off, we prearranged this. There was a coin toss of sorts, and Jon Hartley is going to give his 5-minute opening remarks, followed by 5 minutes from John Early, and then I will do some questions. And then again, that's where you're going to put your questions in.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, for that excellent introduction. And I want to begin, by thanking this august audience for hosting this debate, Chancellor May, Jennifer, and everyone who helped to put this event together. I think I want to start by just reframing the sort of debate question before us. And I think that the sort of central question really here is, do we want more or less public spending on R&D, research directed towards scientific progress? And I know that's a question that is very close to a lot of people here. What do we mean by public funding? In this context, we're really meaning government spending on projects related to R&D. And really, I want to sort of begin with a few questions here and just talk about a few projects and things that have been funded by government research over the years. So I want to start by just simple question. Would we have the internet today or would we have had the internet as early as we did in the early 1990s without public funding for scientific research? And I think the answer in my mind is pretty clearly no. I mean, the internet was actually developed through DARPA, which is an agency of the Department of Defense. In fact, the internet originally, when it was first created, the first node-to-node communication was called ARPANET. And it actually happened between UCLA and Stanford, so right here in California. And that's just one example. I mean, GPS, which we all use on our phones here, it was originally developed by publicly funded defense research in the 1970s. Modern biotechnology rests on decades of public funding through the NIH, which invests about $45 billion a year in this. Public funding for basic research has also helped create basically the scientific foundation which the entire modern biotech industry now rests. If anyone here got an mRNA vaccine during COVID, that in part was related to public funding for research. So these investments didn't just produce scientific papers; they produced really enormous economic returns for not just these companies that were involved, but for society at large. I mean, today the internet contributes arguably trillions of dollars to the world economy, in which many businesses rest and communicate with every day. GPS alone, similar. Could you imagine how we could drive to and from this event perhaps without it? Logistics, aviation, agriculture, all rest on the same technology that originally came out of some public funding for R&D research. Now, these technologies, they didn't emerge from private markets alone. They emerged from public investment in science. And the reason, or the sort of underlying theory that sort of rests on, is that scientific knowledge, one, it creates spillover benefits that extend well beyond the original inventor. And so, when a discovery is made, other researchers build on it, but because private firms can't capture all these benefits on their own, they typically underinvest in what would be the sort of socially optimal amount of R&D spending. So, at some level, you can look at a number of studies, that find that, in general, social returns on public research maybe are between 20 to 60% a year. The reality is, right now, today, the amount of public spending on R&D has fallen from about 2% of GDP to around 0.7%, where it is today. It was 2% around the height of the Cold War. I think there's, obviously, it goes without saying that private companies play a huge role in innovation. Just look at what's going on with large language models right now and all these companies that are involved. But at the end of the day, we need public research to help set the foundation. Many scientific discoveries, have really, rested on key investments in basic research, which, private sector alone will be underinvested in. So ultimately, it's scientific research that drives economic growth. Economists in general estimate that the majority of economic growth is responsible, or it's largely technological progress that's responsible for economic growth. It's not just people, it's not just machines, but it's ideas. And where do ideas come from? They come from original research, and in part, it can be public funding that plays a really key and critical role in that. So, that all said, the United States became a world-leading economic power, not just by accident, but in large part by investing in science through public investments in science. So the question isn't whether or not public funding for science works. I think the overwhelming evidence is that it does, and I think there's a pretty clear case that we should be increasing it back to levels that we saw in prior times. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jon Hartley. Time for John Early. We keep it simple. We like John's on the stage.
Well, good evening, folks, and thank you for coming. We look forward to the next round here where you get to ask the stump the debaters questions. So I hope we'll get some good ones on that. For the last 200,000 years that humans have inhabited this earth, we have benefited by all sorts of technological and scientific breakthroughs. Whether it's the first major agricultural revolution with enclosement and enclosure, or whether it was the GLP-1 revolution of the last decade. These have come principally and primarily from the investment of money, time, and effort by the private sector. Government has not been an important source of that. In fact, government has principally been a barrier. It has forbidden people to do certain things. It has forbidden looking at foreign sources. And it has also slowed it down through violating property rights and coming in and taking private property away. So it's an interesting history of how this has happened, but let's look at how it got to be that the United States is, in fact, the leader in technology. It began in England with the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which established parliamentary sovereignty and forbid the king to lay taxes or spend money that wasn't authorized by Parliament. And so what happened? There was zero government spending on science and technology except as it related to defense. And Britain became the world leader in technology, overcoming France, Germany, Austria, which were the other big powers, which were primarily government funded. Britain was totally privately funded. And by the end of the 19th century was the leader. Now, at that point, the US picked up and carried it forward, relying on the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the right to do certain things, but funding research is not one of them, except as it would relate to defense. With World War I, II, and the Civil War as well, we always had a certain amount of government spending for defense. After that warfare disappeared, this funding stopped. People tried to get it to continue, but it didn't. The event that triggered substantial US spending on technology was Sputnik in 1957. And all of a sudden, Congress lost its mind and just started spending money left and right. Not just on space, but on just anything that looked like technology. So I'm going to take NIH as an example. Post-1960, NIH spending increased by a factor of 5 over what its increase had been before. So we were increasing the budget of NIH 5 times faster. What did we get for it? If you look at longevity, we were gaining about a third of a year of longevity every year up until 1960. Then NIH started spending a lot of money, and what happened? It dropped to less than a sixth of that to less than a sixth. So it had dropped by a half. So we spent more money and we got less results. Now, why does that happen? That failure comes because NIH and government agencies generally use the wrong model for research. They use what's called a pipeline model. That's one word for it. Is you do a lot of research and you're going to find something. Throw $1 million at some smart people, you'll get something. Mission research is, I want to defeat polio, and then you set out to do that. And that's exactly, of course, what Jonas Salk did, defeated polio. It was not a government-financed operation. It was his money, and it was the march of dimes of private eleemosynary institution. So why does that happen? Why does that fall apart? It's because government has no customers. It does not have to face the market and sell what it does. It has to sell the notion that it is hiring people, building offices, building computer systems, and that if you read their budgets, that's what they're talking about. How much of that stuff do we do? They almost never talk about the health improvements. Now, we can go into the details on all of this, and I'll be glad to tell you about what ARPA did, but we'll wait till the question time for that.
All right. Thank you, John Early. Appreciate your opening statement. Okay, folks, again, this is one of the sanctioned times when you can look at your phone. You should be getting a text message with a link for you to be able to submit your question. I'm going to kick things off with a few questions of my own, and then looking for you guys to populate this iPad so I can throw some questions. Since we just heard from John Early, I'm going to ask Jon Hartley a question. So one of the things that we hear quite a bit about is government waste, fraud, and abuse. You have the Government Accountability Office. You have a number of watchdog groups, both within the government and outside the government, that are finding high levels in some cases. And in healthcare, for example, Medicare and Medicaid fraud is very high. Is there an argument to be made that there's a much stronger accountability mechanism for private research, whether that's private charity or private sector for-profit business, because there's more accountability? You don't have the public sector unions, for example, which are incredibly powerful and protect their members. Why would you support that as opposed to something that is maybe more nimble and more transparent and more able to act more quickly?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Carrie. And for what it's worth, in general, I'm actually very opposed to government spending or increases in government spending, broadly speaking. What really I'm talking about here and what we're really debating is really about basic research. And really the idea is that, it's foundational research that may have some consequences in the very long run that today private firms just aren't investing in. So to sort of give you an example, the idea is, making the investments in the 1950s and 60s that the Department of Defense did in sort of basic material science research that helped contribute to the development of the computer chip. So that's the kind of basic research funding and subsidies that I'm talking about, not subsidizing Intel today, which is arguably sort of a dying and floundering company. And the Chips and Science Act put a few $1 billion into it in a few years ago under the Biden administration. Totally arguing against that or industrial, not in any way arguing in favor of industrial policies or picking winners and losers. I think a lot of that has not a very good track record. The point is that just there's a general underinvestment in the sort of very basic research. In fact, a lot of the kind of research in part that's done in the science wings of these sorts of universities, like here at UC Davis, making the case that there's just a simple underinvestment on the part of firms, and that investing in those technologies or the development of that basic research can lead to things down the future. A lot of that may actually, a lot of that funding may end up going in directions that don't go anywhere. But the point is that just when you do enough of it, broadly speaking, that you do get these moonshot cases of things like the development of the computer chip in the 1950s and 60s, the development of GPS in the 1970s, the development of the internet, ARPANET in late 1960s. The World Wide Web Protocol was built at CERN, another governmental institution over in Europe. And so the point is not, we should be increasing government spending, broadly and everywhere and funding companies or picking winners and losers. I think a lot of that has a very mixed, largely bad track record in general. The point is that there's just a simple underinvestment in basic research that goes on, and that the government should play a role in that.
Thank you. John Early, so I heard in your remarks a carve out in your UK example for defense. Is there an argument that there are some causes that are just too enormous, like national security, or maybe too small, like maybe an obscure disease that only affects a few people that would otherwise not be profitable for a for-profit company to do research on? Is there an argument for defense, or just in general, causes that are just too enormous for private sector or charity alone? Or too small, both?
The decision criteria that you outlined there is not the proper one, and is not the reason why defense is proper. It's because defense is a specific spending assignment given by the Constitution to the federal government. Therefore, ipso facto, research to support defense is a proper federal government activity. So that's the reason for it, not because it's big or small or more important in some way. It's fundamentally a government activity, therefore the research associated with it properly belongs with government. Healthcare is not a government activity, despite the efforts to take it over, because it is not listed there in Article 1 of the Constitution, even by implication. So you need to have some other justification for it. And something being small means simply that it's perfect for private foundation work. And we have thousands of private foundations. The United States has 4 times more private funding of health and welfare institutions than any other country. Number 2 is Australia, who is far, far behind us, because that is the way we work. And so it's not because it's big or because it's small, it's because defense is a government function. And when the other functions generally have to meet the market criteria, are people willing to pay for it? Because when we fund it out of government funds, it means the government, by force, takes money from everyone sitting here in one form or another and puts it to topic A. Well, half of us might not like topic A. 2/3 of us may not like topic A. But we have other people making our choices for us. So most research should focus on succeeding in the market. And let me give you a good example, just picking off of one of John's. The mRNA development, false. That was not a government-funded activity. The people that developed that, and her name escapes me right now, but submitted 20 different proposals for mRNA vaccine research to the NIH mostly, but some to the NSF. And they were all turned down. So she worked off of her own account and off of some of her colleagues' accounts trying to make some progress, and ultimately went to work for a small biotech company that developed it. And Pfizer, which was the company that came out with the first vaccine for COVID, developed the most, and by the standard calculation, saved the most lives, took $0 from the federal government. They explicitly turned down the money that was offered through Operation Warp Speed. And the CEO said, I don't want my researchers having to deal with the bureaucracy. So they turned down $1.5 million and put in $1.5 million of their own to develop it. So that is just plain not true.
Thank you. Jon Hartley, when we're talking about public good, there has been considerable debate around COVID issues, including Steamboat Institute. We've done campus debates around it. The NIH awarded grants to the EcoHealth Alliance, a US-based nonprofit, which subsequently sub-awarded funds to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for research on bat coronaviruses. Among other pieces of evidence, the former CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, testified that in his view, U.S. tax dollars facilitated this research that helped contribute to the gain-of-function research linked to the creation of the COVID-19 virus. Isn't this the exact opposite of public good? There was a lot of outcry saying that there was not accountability, again, for incompetence, negligence, or even malice, and this was funded by U.S. taxpayers. So what would you say in response to questions around research that, there's also a question here from the audience around unethical government funding, testing, historically in the U.S., there have been many government projects that are very questionable over the years, including racially motivated research targeting African Americans that is very morally reprehensible using tax dollars. So what would you say in response to those critics who say this is just a wrong use of public money?
I fully agree with you and the member of the audience who asked the question. One, science is very powerful, and and technology is very powerful, and directed inappropriately in immoral directions. You just see what happened with gain-of-function research in Wuhan, and it created a global the worst pandemic in 100 years. So you can see the dangers of what happens when science and research funding is in the wrong hands and goes in negative directions. So I think first and foremost there has to be a very high ethical and moral standard in everything that we do as in government, everything that we do as citizens, and to say the least. That there's a very long list of terrible things that the government is funded or been involved in over the years, and a list far too long to be able to go through with you now. But no, I think we need guardrails, we need barriers, and for what it's worth, I think in recent years, things have gone very astray in terms of what are the sorts of things the National Science Foundation is funding. A number of things that the NIH has been funding. I know Jay Bhattacharya has changed a lot of funding. There were these terrible experiments being done on beagles, I think, which is horrifying as a dog lover. And I think now there's actually leadership that's changed certain things around, for example, animal research, that that basically we're saying that it's only should only be done when absolutely necessary, and that there's no other genetic models that could be used to test something. So I think at some level, morals have to guide everything we do. Technology is something that I think is something that's directed. I don't think it's the case that any particular event is or finding is something that's inevitable. I think we have the ability to control technology and to control and shape science, and the government does play a big role in that. And COVID is a case study in how things can go very, very wrong when things are not being watched over appropriately and morally.
So would you say our resolution is, be it resolved, scientific progress is best achieved through publicly funded research initiatives? Is it best funded?
What do we mean by best, right? That's, I guess, the key question, right? At some level, we can't, it's wrong to, I think, force firms to do things that they do not want to do. I think, in general, if we look at a lot of economic empirical research, in general, you don't want to regulate firms. I think at some level you want to have a tax and transfer system that funds these important functions of limited government. I think public funding for research initiatives is one of them. But I think right now, I mean, our overall R&D spending in the U.S. is around $1 trillion, and again, it's our public funding for R&D is only 0.7% of GDP today. It was about 2% at the height of the Cold War, when things like the internet and our GPS and these things were being developed. And I think that there's a case to be made that if you were to up it back to maybe 2%, you would maybe get some big moonshot results potentially, like we saw in these particular examples. So by best, government is obviously something that we can control. If we passed a bill tomorrow, we could increase R&D spending from 0.7% of GDP to 2%. So I think in that sense, it's something that we can easily control. I think that's what I would mean by something that we can best achieve some additional potential scientific progress from.
John Hartley, you look like you want to respond, and please, both of you guys,
me
feel free to respond to
add a
that as well.
little perspective to that. It's not just talking about deviations. It's almost inherent in the model whereby government hires the best scientists because they can pay the salaries that allows them to do whatever research they want to do, because they submit proposals to do what they want to do, not what the market wants to buy. So it's inherent in that sort of process. And for example, how it is deteriorated, it's not just that we had deviations by Fauci and crew, it is baked into the very essence of the National Institutes of Health. They actually have departments of medical ethics, not to identify the ethical solutions that are practiced in medicine, but to create new ones. And this gave us the Tuskegee Untreated Syphilis Project. And it gave us many other things, of course, the COVID gain of function research that were clearly inappropriate. And here we have a government agency proposing and spending our money to define what is ethical. And these are not elected officials. These are bureaucrats, just like you and me. So the 50 of us here get together and decide what's ethical, and then we want to issue a government declaration of what's ethical. NIH is paying for that. They're going and corralling a bunch of people that agree with their view of it. And one of the interesting minutes of one of these committees revolved around this question. This was having to do with neurological treatments in the brain, of electronic kinds of treatments. And the statement was put into the record that they were concerned that the concern with privacy and the parents' right for children meant that the policies were protecting children from research rather than protecting children with research. What is their objective? Doing research, not making the children healthy. And they wanted to abridge the parents' rights and the standard rights and the standard procedure that normally in neurological research, you test it first on adults. You don't test it first on children because, first of all, their neural systems are much more malleable. A tweak at age 4 may be devastating, whereas at age 40 it might not be. But nevertheless, they were seeking to do that, and that's what NIH is paying for. NIH is paid for a research project to test whether or not meditation and exercise could reduce colds, basically, upper respiratory infections, and 98% of them were colds. And so they went out and they spent a couple $1 million to do that. And the results were ambiguous because their sample size was too small. Of course, that was stupid to start with because they should have known sample size was too small. Well, they didn't prove that it didn't prove that it worked, although it found out that it worked on some other variables that weren't specified in the research design. So they said, well, we want more money to get a bigger sample. Okay, well, you might say, well, I'll try it with that, even though it sounds like a dumb project. So they went out, they quadrupled the size of the sample, and it came back with essentially the same results, except it showed that exercise actually had a significant negative impact. And they said, well, we all want more money to try it yet again. So this is the kind of thing we keep researching over and over again, because what we have is if we have people who do research on meditation and exercise, I may, if I'm in that group, I may submit a proposal to NIH today. Next year, I may review that a similar proposal by somebody else. And then the year after that, I review the journal article that they wrote for. And it's the same set of people. It keeps circling around. We're employing scientists by scientists reviewing scientists. And certainly peer review is an important piece of it, but it doesn't work when government is running it because there is no market check on it. That's what is important. And, John was talking about how research as a percent of GDP has gone down. But that's because defense research has gone down. If you take out and look at health-based research, 5% of basic research in health before 1960 was done by NIH and the National Research Council. Okay, so they did 5% of it. Today they do 75% of that basic research. So it is shifted. And it's not that there's not enough being spent. The private sector spends on the next steps of research beyond the basic research. They spend 66% of it. But on the basic research, the federal government basically serves as a gate to stop research that they don't like and promote research that's probably useless.
All right, thank you. Jon Hartley, and thank you all. We're getting some really great, interesting questions here, so appreciate all of the participation. Jon Hartley, I'm going to give you this question from the audience. This person asks, did government research work in the USSR? So you mentioned the 2% GDP spend here in the US, and the USSR was a socialist country, and it collapsed, and it was doing, I don't know what their GDP spend was, but the government was commanding and controlling the economy over there, and then it collapsed. So I'm gathering from this question, they're saying, well, this is an example of the government controlling all the research, and they ended up losing.
Well, I wouldn't associate the fact that they lost with their investments in public in R&D. I mean, they put a satellite in space before the U.S. did with Sputnik. I mean, there were, you look at all the post-USSR, scientists that came to the U.S. or maybe some escaped, before the fall of the wall. I mean, many of these, Russian scientists who became Americans, I mean, they became some of the best and brightest in the U.S. and some of the best mathematicians of the world, best chess players in the world, you name it. Some of these people were, benefiting from those public investments. Of course, the USSR was a total disaster, and I'm the first person to tell you this. I was born on the day the Berlin Wall fell. It's a shame that my whole generation and everybody born after me has no memory of the USSR because of how atrocious it was, and is a great example of how socialism and socialist economies don't work. But that's a very different question from I'd say public spending on R&D. One thing, just sort of talking to one of John's points earlier, I fully agree. In general, markets work best without interference from government. And I'm one of the first people to stand up and say this. There's just the interesting thing about public investment and thinking about the long run is we're dealing with uncertainty. And really trying to understand the unknown. That's what scientific process and discovery is. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of researchers here. If you work on research, you don't necessarily know what the results are going to be of your experiment or the research question that you're sitting down, and trying to answer. And similarly, the people in 1950 and 1960, I highly doubt that many people then could even understand whether they would want a computer or understand what their demand would be eventually for these things that would come much later, but in part because of investments in material sciences and other areas, they were able to sort of jumpstart the development of some of the early computer chips. You can kind of say the same thing with maybe, GPS, it's developed in the 70s. It's really military technology, and it turned out later that you could use it to, come drive over to the debate tonight. And, similar with the internet, people, were just, trying to send messages to each other from Stanford to UCLA. And who would have known in 1969, that you could then have, one of these and send emails to other people in the middle of a debate up here. I'm not doing that for what that's worth. But at some level, the market, at some level, while it works very well, at some level, there's things in the future, the unknown, dealing with uncertainty. That's really the core of what basic science is. And at some level, because there's so much uncertainty, because it's such a long run thing, firms sometimes just don't invest enough in these sorts of very basic scientific efforts. And I think that's really the case for why public R&D might be the one exception to this rule that, government doesn't really work well in general in promoting good economic outcomes.
John Hartley, you want to respond? And then I've got a question for you from the audience.
Well, let me give a short on that. The people that really know how to manage to uncertainty are who? They are the entrepreneurs. You're going to start a business. You don't know if anybody's going to come buy your stuff. You don't know if you will be able to spread it across the city or across the state. Amazon. Who knew that you could develop that kind of a distribution system? SpaceX, succeeding far beyond what NASA could do. So the people that know how to manage to that are the investors, big and small, personal and institutional. Government bureaucrats have no clue. And I was one of them at one point, so I know. I lived in that bureaucracy. Uncertainty is something that they can't live with, because the certainty is I get a bigger office, I get promoted, I hire 5 new staff, I issue 5 new research contracts. So it's not a market failure. In fact, the Errol Nelson hypotheses about those back in the 60s were just plain wrong. We learned, we were taught. I'm so old that I actually studied those guys in macroeconomics. But by the time I got to advanced macroeconomics, we were saying that was all junk. It is not market failure because they're using a model that assumed perfect information. Well, no market ever had perfect information. That is just a teaching tool, and they turned the teaching tool into a prescription. So that's a long-winded answer, sorry.
Do you want to respond to that, Jon Hartley, real quick?
Well, there is, this question, I think, about externalities, in part what John is getting to. And I think I would agree in general that, perhaps, the externalities line has been maybe abused by many economists. And, you look at things like, there's a whole set of things like smoking and cigarette taxes. We don't like secondhand smoke, and we don't like the fact that cigarettes unfortunately kill people. And so the idea is we tax these things because they have harm. There's some, we want to reduce the sort of social harm of these things, right? But at some, you could make similar arguments about soda, right? We should tax soda, and there's maybe some negative harm from the obesity caused by these things, and sometimes I think you'll find economists will try and argue everything is a market externality at some level. I think that's a wrong-headed approach. But when it comes to, I think public R&D spending, at some level, basic research, the kind of work that people do in this room here, every day. At some level, I think, could the people in this room, would they be funded if, say the NIH or NSF didn't exist? Recent NIH, NSF issues aside, there is politics in these things, and it does matter what gets funded and what doesn't. And we need smart people actually working in the NSF, in the NIH, figuring out which types of research seems promising in a meritocratic way. I think a lot of what's gone on in the NIH and NSF in recent years, I think things went very much astray for a number of reasons. But at some level, I think you have to ask, it's the type of research that gets funded at research universities, including UC Davis. Would that otherwise be funded, without it? And or without these sorts of agencies and without these sorts of efforts. And it may be the case that most research initiatives, and I'm a researcher myself, often a lot of research projects go nowhere. That's life in research. But at some level, it takes an enormous amount of fixed costs, an enormous amount of spending up front to be able to generate some of these incredible findings that can drive these massive shifts in technology, and a lot of these things, still happen at universities today.
Right. Well, Jon, so that kind of gets to this audience question for Jon Early, which is you're talking about design and how to structure these research projects. So in your opening statement, Jon Early, you mentioned this your critique of what you called the pipeline model versus the mission research model. Can you explain that a little bit more just for folks, what you mean by that? And a person from the audience is asking about if government were to shift over to this mission model, which you seem to be more in approval of, would you then be in favor of it if that reform was made?
Okay, a couple parts there. First, clarifying what these, a little bit, without being too long-winded, what these two models are. The mission model says we want to cure polio. We want to put a man on the moon. We want to inoculate the population against COVID. Okay, those are missions. It has an outcome. And when research is outcome focused, now their outcome may turn out to be false, or an alternative may come up from the research, but they've got to focus on doing something. When the research is focused on a result, not a paper, but a real life result. Now it may be intermediate to getting the result, but it's mission focused. That is effective research. Almost all privately funded research is mission focused. Why? Because people will give either donations for the nonprofit side or investments for the for-profit side, their money to do the research because it's going for something that's going to be useful, it's going for something that is important for them. When it's tax dollars, as the former Prime Minister of England used to say, pretty soon you run out of other people's money. Because you're using other people's money, you're not focused on some outcome. You're focused on what interests you. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's true because you're not focused on something. And it kind of relates to some of the things Jon has mentioned along the way. Like, well, we got some really bright Soviet scientists. Absolutely. It's not that the scientists aren't bright. It's they're working on projects that are not necessarily the ones that you or I want to pay for. If I want to pay for it, I will buy it in the marketplace or I will make my charitable donations to support it. But when government comes and says we will take by force money from you to do research that somebody else wants to do, I'm not quite so keen on it. So anyway, that's the dimension around the difference between the mission focused and then the pipeline, which is said, we have this faith that if we just do research, we're going to get something out of it. Now, I'm being a little bit flip about it, but that's kind of what it works out to. Is it interesting? Does it move our knowledge forward? Well, what does the result of that? Does it reduce death? Does it reduce suffering? Does it reduce hunger? Does it make people happy? Will they buy it? Well, those questions aren't asked usually in the public sector. Now, to this part of the question about if we used a mission-focused work, would I be not quite so negative? I'm not really waffling on it, but it has two pieces to it. The one is, if we actually could make it work, I would be less negative, because there's a whole lot of it that couldn't pass the mission test. In other words, because it doesn't have a mission that's important to the people of this country, we shouldn't be doing it. And that's about 40% of between 30 and 40% of NIH expenditures are in that category. But NIH used to be mission focused before 1960, before the spending rose. And they actually had to, the universities didn't go to NIH and said, could you give us research money? In the early 60s and late 50s, NIH and the National Science Foundation were running around recruiting and begging universities to take their money. That was not the model. Now, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, I think is what it is. In 1970, there was an audit of the DARPA projects. There were 20 major weapons systems that had been developed over the study period. Of those, there were contributing to those 20 products were 700 scientific, and they used the general term events, because it may have been a technological development, it may have been a research project, it may have been any number of things. So there were 700 pieces that went into those 20. Only 2 of those 700 were basic science research. They were otherwise fundamental engineering kinds of research. Now, the National Science Foundation saw this and they said, oh, no, that just can't be true. And so they went back and they did some more research and they said, well, we found 50 more of these that are basic science. Okay, fair enough. But then you take the list of the 50 that they found that were, and they all came from more than 50 years before and were all privately funded. So then Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader back then, pushed through the budget and through the president a change to what was just was called ARPA at the time, without the defense in front of it, and said, we're going to make this now DARPA with the defense in front of it, because it's going to work only on defense-related projects. And so they wound up firing about half the staff. Oh, disaster. Well, it gets back to talented scientists can be hired to do better stuff. And Xerox PARC, which is their research group, hired many of these people. And from that, we got laser printing, we got Windows, we got the mouse, we got the GUI interface. They were just off chasing rainbows and unicorns over here in ARPA. But when we made it DARPA, they went over to a private sector research bunch that was creating stuff that people wanted, or at least they would want. It would help develop the economy and help develop prosperity. That's the difference between when the government's running it and when it's not. So yes. Can I do one more example? No, let me.
I want to give a question to Jon Hartley. So, something that John early mentioned or touched on was he quoted the late Margaret Thatcher saying, "At some point, you're going to run out of other people's money." And I'm a resident of Virginia. We have a new governor. She won on a campaign around issues of affordability, and a lot of people are struggling to pay their everyday bills. And so when you look at government spending overall, our debt to GDP levels are higher than they were in World War II. It's the highest that they've ever been. So isn't there an argument to be made that when you're talking about, like, for example, in Silicon Valley, a vast majority of startups fail, and it's only those few winners that basically subsidize all the losers? Why should we use taxpayer money when people are struggling? So you're taking money from hardworking Americans to basically fund the slot machines for this public research.
Well, to some degree, to some degree, you could make an argument that public investments over time, over long periods of time, may be able to offset some of those costs, or maybe even pay for themselves. You think about, again, it's like, say that ARPA didn't exist, and how many years later would the internet have come around? It's like the World Wide Web, popularized it came out of CERN, another governmental agency, or lots of great physics work going on there in Europe. But because of, say maybe, we got a jump start on the internet, say a few years earlier, because of this research that was in part, publicly subsidized, we got, massive gains in GDP some years earlier. So, at some level, I think, one, public research funding, if properly, aimed and targeted, with the right moral and ethical guidelines. And that's not to say, the past few years, things haven't been a bit astray and that things can't be improved. At some level, these are, I think, some of the most critical investments that we can be making as a society. At the end of the day, there just are uncertainties. The mission-driven model is excellent, and it's wonderful if you're a private sector donor. You want to be able to see results in your own lifetime. In many cases, the challenge is just sometimes the future is very unknown, and we don't know exactly what the future of scientific progress could look like, and without doing some meaningful amounts of public research. It's not to say there's certainly diminishing returns. Today, if we were to up our public R&D spending from 0.7% to 2%, like what it was, or 2% of GDP, like what it was during the Cold War, my guess is you up things further, there's always diminishing gains. This is totally true. I guess my point is just, if you look at the history of public subsidies for R&D, there's a lot of things out there that that have been associated with these sorts of grants. You think, getting back to the NIH, HIV treatments, other gene therapies have been in part funded by the NIH. There's great work done by economists that are very much focused on causal inference and trying to trace out, are additional funds for NIH or NSF actually creating new innovations. And if you sort of do some pretty technical work in understanding the NIH funding rules, some great work by Pierre Azoulay and his co-authors have found that essentially an additional $10 million of NIH spending will generate an additional 2.3 patents. Those patents could lead to more economic activity.
And then do you support, there's a question here about related to patents and intellectual property. Do you support the government basically getting a license or some sort of, benefit financially to give that money back to taxpayers? And relatedly, what do you think of the Trump administration buying, or it's essentially getting equity in some private companies? Do you support that?
So these are kind of big questions, and I argue that these are a little bit out. The last one, at least, is a little bit outside the scope of the debate, because we're talking about public subsidies for research. Getting into whether the government should own a 10% share in a company is another issue. And I think there's arguments sort of on both sides of these things. One, I think that the case that the administration's made is that some of these in large part, they're critical mineral companies that they're investing in. That the government, for national security reasons, needs to keep an eye on these and ensure that there's enough critical minerals in the supply chain to be able to continue a safe supply of chips should there be some invasion of Taiwan by China. So that's that argument. We're not here to really talk about that. But really, I think. Sorry, so remind me the first question again.
The patents. Do you support public ownership or an equity stake or some sort of basically investment return for all the taxpayer money used to develop these intellectual properties?
Well, it's a good question. In general about what. So one, what are patents? And really, patents are, monopolies that are granted over periods of time to inventors who come up with these things. There's a good question about patent policy in general, whether patent strength is too strong or too weak. And I think that's a very healthy debate in innovation in general. There have been some changes in intellectual property law in the past 20 years, changing, between first to file, first to invent, where the U.S. shifted in the 2010s. At some level, you could argue that the U.S. is getting an immediate benefit from the patent system, which is you are awarding a patent to someone. They have this monopoly for a short period of time, and they can develop things with it that benefit American society at large. I think you could argue, you could make arguments that to some degree, I guess if some research were to generate very productive, some very productive business, maybe they would owe some of that back to the government. That's typically not how I think things have been done. Within a university, for example, a university taxes these sorts of things. A lot of a certain fraction of a grant will go to the university to subsidize other areas of the university. That's typically how these things, how a university will work. I think there's plenty of room for discussion about how some of these things could be reallocated. Maybe the U.S. taxpayer should get some things back for subsidizing these things. But I would say in general, the U.S. taxpayer certainly benefits just from all the innovation that comes out of these some of these efforts.
We have a question, a legal question. Maybe it's from a law student in the audience for Jon Early. They want to know, they said, John too said that the role of the federal government is strictly limited, but what about the General Welfare Clause, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution that allows Congress to tax and spend for the general welfare of the nation?
Yeah, that one comes up all the time. But what you got to read carefully, and I should have brought it along with me, it's as with respect to the preceding 16, it's a modifier to those in order to promote the general welfare. In other words, they execute 1 through 17 in order to promote the general welfare. It doesn't say, and anything else they want to do to promote the general welfare. As I said, I should have brought it along, I guess, but that's roughly what the argument would go on. And that's pretty generally believed by constitutional scholars.
What about the elastic clause as well?
The which clause?
They call it the elastic clause,
No,
which is just kind of just the necessary and proper.
Yeah, but that's part of the same. That's part of the same clause. It's necessary and proper in order to do the 17 things that are listed above. That it's not to do anything else you want to do.
And has this been challenged in the courts?
Sometimes, and I mean, and there some of the limits have come from that. We could have some more.
What are some of the effective legal arguments that you've seen in support in the courts to support your position?
No, I can't cite cases because I didn't study up on that one.
All right, you stumped.
But in any case, it is one view of that there is that limitation. We got 17 things listed, and the enabling clauses are that you enable just to do those 17 things. It's not to run chip companies, which we agree on. So don't anybody try and sell us any chip companies.
So when we were talking about the argument around just, again, this question of best, I think that's really kind of where this debate really, the crux really kind of hinges on. And I know, John, we talked about it. Do you think that when we're talking about government funding in general, do you think that because you've laid out lots of different scenarios and examples, the internet, DARPA, et cetera, are there areas where you think that the government did the worst? And do you think that private sector and private charity, private investment does better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important, I think, to highlight that, I think a lot of, basic research, which, I think public research can play a role in, is complementary to all the private sector research that goes on. I mean, there's, I think John gave a great example, okay, so we had in the 1960s, we had the space race, again, started with the Russians and Sputnik moment. JFK said we put a man on the moon in the next 10 years, and they did. And they showed the world what was possible. And so they put in that initial upfront investment. And it turned out, that it was great. They got a man on the moon. And, they haven't done a trip to, there hasn't been a manned trip to the moon since 1972, and that's going to change with the Artemis 2 mission when that hopefully happens. Or Artemis 3 will put people on the moon, and Artemis 2 will be the next or the first time that there's been a manned a spacecraft going to the moon. So it's going to circle around it and it's going to come back. But the point is, it turns out that NASA wasn't very good at scaling things, and it took a private inventor like Elon Musk to really commercialize this whole space industry. And you look at all the satellites that are being launched. I mean, there's massive commercial value from all these satellites. And remember, GPS is part of those satellites in part, but there's a lot that goes on. But it's a case where you had some public effort or research that sort of upstart something, showed that something was kind of possible as a use case. The fixed costs were so high to begin with. No, private investor in the 1960s, could have created their own space program then. But that sort of initial, showing what was possible was done, and it allowed, the private sector to come along later to, really take things to scale. And of course, the private sector does almost, most things, better than the government. But oftentimes when it comes to very big projects that require a lot of upfront investment, that basically the private sector isn't willing to take the risk on because it's just so big and so expensive, that and maybe too uncertain and maybe too far off in the future, that's really where the one exception where government can step in. But clearly, the private sector has done incredible job at making things cheaply, whether it's computers, obviously computer chips now are largely produced by the private sector, and they could do it largely entirely without public subsidies. But you look at the case of NVIDIA. But again, it's like that idea for the some of the original public funding started in the 1950s and 60s with some R&D from the public sector. So I think at some level, public spending on R&D has this ability to crowd in investment and work in a complementary role with the private sector. But when things were simple enough, prior to the 1950s, you think about Henry Ford and the automobile. I mean, he did he built that whole process largely in just a private sector capacity. So I mean, there's plenty of stories in history where the private sector has been able to do many things on its own. But as it turns out, I think as time has gone on, some ideas have become in the economy and technology has become a lot more complicated. At some level, I think sometimes it takes just a big upfront investment with maybe a little bit of help from the public sector in order to jumpstart things and get them going.
All right, thank you. I'm going to give Jon Hartley a chance to respond to that, and then we're going to move to the closing statements.
I think I would just repeat things I had said already. Okay.
All right, well then let's wrap it up. Okay, we got closing statements, 5 minutes each, and Jon Hartley is going to go first, and Jon Hartley gets the last word.
Okay. So thank you again. Thank you again, Carrie, and everyone who came to this debate. Really, I think the main really question here is whether current funding levels are sufficient for public spending on R&D, and whether or not we could increase in our investment in R&D from the public sector would generate maybe some greater benefits. And I think the evidence pretty clearly shows that public scientific funding has produced some extraordinarily high economic returns. And that, I think reducing or failing to maybe increase that investment would maybe be economically short-sighted. And let's just begin with the historical record. I mean, the U.S. invested far more heavily in scientific research, relative to its size of the economy in the middle of the 20th century. At its peak, again in the Cold War during the space race, it exceeded. Its public R&D spending exceeded about 2% of GDP. Today, it's less than half that at 0.7%. And yet those investments in that time helped produce the internet, the computer chip, modern computing, the semiconductor technology underlying it, the internet, GPS, advances in medicine that are still transforming the world today. And so put it briefly, I think many of these technologies that drive trillions of dollars of economic output today, or in which trillions of dollars of economic output today rests on, emerged from this period where public and scientific investment was a lot greater than it is right now. And so it's important because I think it shows that higher levels of public and scientific investment have happen to coincide with higher or with periods of extraordinarily high technological progress and economic growth. Second, the economic returns of public research, I think, remain pretty high. There's a lot of research that shows that, roughly speaking, the social returns of R&D from sort of where we're at right now are roughly about 20 to 60% annually. And it's larger than the government's current cost of borrowing, if you were to look at the 10-year government treasury bond yield. And, so again, we have to think about this, again, there's a lot of basic research that won't be funded by the private sector out there. And, essentially this basic research, what the government can do, it's got a very long time horizon. It can make investments in areas that may produce a lot of fruit in the future. And so, again, other countries recognize this. China, for example, they've increased their scientific investment dramatically over the past 2 decades. If the U.S. reduces or fails to increase its investment, I think it really risks falling behind in technological leadership, which it's had for well over a century now. And so finally, I think we have to really recognize that scientific investment is also just fundamentally different from ordinary spending. Again, we're talking about the long run. We're not talking about investing in particular companies, picking winners and losers. We're talking about sort of the basic research that gets done that can spawn things in the future. Things like what we call general purpose technologies, things that are platforms on which other things are then built. For example, the internet is a general purpose technology. AI today is a general purpose technology. Our large language models. But again, we wouldn't have the ability to. The private sector wouldn't have the ability to create large language models today if it wasn't for building our internet infrastructure, for building our computer chips. Things that came out of public investment in part. So in conclusion, I think the evidence shows that public scientific research does generate some high social returns in the long run, and that can play an important role in driving technological progress and strengthening long-run economic growth. And so if anything, I think the historical record suggests that higher levels of scientific investment help produce the technological leadership and economic prosperity that the United States still enjoys today. So I think it's, for all these reasons and more, that it's important that we continue these important public investments in the scientific foundation of our future prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon Hartley.
Well, I deeply enjoyed this time together, and I hope you all found it useful. Somebody's been holding back on those questions, though. Those were nice questions. But if you got some nasty ones, hang around. We can go over them afterwards. Let me offer up 4 things to think about. One is history. Whether you want to look at 220,000 years, or you want to look since the 5th century before the current era, or whether you want to look at the 100 or the 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, or you want to look at the United States up to 1960, the answer is clear. The science that moved civilization forward and made our standard of living better was privately funded. Government didn't do it. And in the last 200 years, the experience of first Great Britain versus Europe, and then the United States says it doesn't do it. That is not what moves our prosperity. The fact that the numbers that John was citing of investment dropping from 2% to 0.7%. Well, it depends on what you count in that. But that said, nevertheless, what could be driving that is something that we haven't discussed, which is government drives out private. It doesn't just do additional. Because what happens? If government is spending $500 million on topic A, well, if I'm in the private sector, I'm probably not going to spend $500 million on private A. I'm going to go do B or something else. So you're driving out that what would have been, in all probability, a better performance. So we have this driving out. Government, when it's big, drives out in 2 ways. One, if it captures a particular area of research, in general, people aren't going to do that privately because this guy, the big guy over here, is spending $1 billion. But it also, government hires good scientists because A, it pays a lot, and B, it has a lot of different jobs that it can do. So it drives out people from working in the private sector. And my example about what happened to ARPA, then DARPA, is when those people were fired, they went and did great things outside of government by government downsizing. So look at history and the effect there, and look at the crowding out and the effect there. Before 1960, NIH and the National Science Foundation spent 5% of basic science research in health. This is in the health area. Today, they spend 75%. They're not adding to, they're driving out. A good example of the difference between the 2 research models, and a reason why you could argue that maybe the government might learn how to do it right, for some very strange reasons that had to do with the way the budget is structured. When the so-called peace dividend was declared, all of a sudden, several $1 million showed up on the DoD budget for the Department of Defense Breast Cancer Research Project. And it still stays there to this day. So we've got breast cancer research going on in NIH and in the Department of Defense. Now, the Department of Defense is run by an Army general and has been since the day one. Now, of course, he has a lot of bright scientists working for him. But if you compare and contrast the 2024 budget submissions for these 2 groups, you see the difference between traditional government-run projects and a mission focus. And if all the governments were run that way, you might have less of an argument. But the fact is, the nature of government inherently drives them that way. This one just happens to be an interesting outlier. So if you look at those budget documents, the DoD breast cancer research program leads with, we have developed 4 new, funded the development of 4 new drugs for improving outcomes in breast cancer, and gotten approval and implementation of a new standard of care algorithm for breast cancer of certain types. Outcomes that mean better health. The NIH National Cancer Institute listed two things that were their top priorities. One, developing a new data system. And secondly, recruiting more people to be in drug trials. Now, both of those are useful things to do. You know, we change the oil, we eat vegetables. Those are things we do in life, but they're not breakthroughs. We're going to get rid of cancer. See, that's the difference. The government builds data systems, recruits additional stuff. So that's the difference. So do we want health outcomes or do we just want more bureaucracy?
All right. Thank you very much, Jon Hartley. Appreciate it. And that concludes our debate. This is the part again where you can bring out your phone and we're going to vote to see what the change was. So how did the audience move? We're going to put both results up and you can see while folks are still voting. As Jon Hartley mentioned, stick around afterward if you want to talk to our panelists. There were so many questions that we didn't have time to get to, so please, there will be food and bring your questions to these great economists.
So let's make sure we get everyone voted, especially if you voted, and those of you watching the live stream, if you voted in the first poll, please vote in the second one. It looks like the negative position gained the most traction. Carrie, you're the moderator. What do you call here?
There was, yes, it looks like you pulled over 26% of the voters so far. Some people are still voting. So from a change standpoint, again, we're always looking at the delta. You're the winner of this debate.
As I said, it's easy.
But, I think we were talking with the chancellor before, one of the reasons why we do the Steamboat debate series, it's really just to encourage folks to come with an open mind, maybe learn some new things, be challenged, meet people and have an exchange of ideas and do it in a way that's respectful and really just being open to focus on substance and things that are important instead of, there are a lot of alternative universes out there where you can get other content, but we really try to make this substantive and civil. And I think that these gentlemen did this. So let's give them another round of applause.
Round of applause for Carrie, our moderator, and our panelists. If we could just have just one more minute of your time, and then I'll turn it over to Chancellor May to close it out. First of all, Chancellor May, I want to say thank you for having us as part of the Chancellor's Colloquium. It's really an honor to be here. Also, the constitutional question came up, and I had to laugh because we do have pocket constitutions out front. If you'd like to grab one, feel free to take one on your way out. Once again, thank you to our sponsors, particularly the Adolf Coors Foundation and all of our foundation supporters. If you enjoyed this evening's debate and would like to support the Steamboat Institute, we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We would love to have your support. Go to Steamboat Institute to support us and to learn more about our upcoming debates. This debate will be available on our YouTube channel. Generally, we have these up within 48 hours. You are welcome to share it, encourage others to watch it. We'll have short clips on social media. And really just thank you again for coming. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chancellor May.
I'll be brief. Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Again, I'd like to thank the Steamboat Institute for organizing this colloquium, and thank you, Carrie, for moderating, and thank our panelists for a vigorous debate and dialogue. Let's try to keep the conversation going afterwards during the reception. I just want to let you know the next Chancellor's Colloquium will be held in the spring quarter. Look for a guest announcement and ticket information in the coming weeks. That's what I call keeping you in suspense. So I won't divulge who the guests will be, but I guarantee it'll be a good one. For now, I invite all to gather in the lobby for a reception. Thanks for coming.